Are you new to homesteading and getting the spring fever for a garden? Today, we're breaking down the first steps to starting a new garden. Whether you are brand new to growing a garden or a few years into it, I hope you can take some tips away from this episode. Welcome to Simply Living Homestead, where we empower homesteaders and preserve traditions. I'm your host, Amanda Carlin, and I help homesteading families bring peace and order to their lives. My friend, are you overwhelmed with all the tasks on your homestead? Do you wish for a mentor to guide you through the tough moments each day? Then you've come to the right place. Together, we will learn to organize our homestead, love our families well, and walk in the peace of God. If you're ready to get unstuck from the constant feeling of overwhelm, then join us each week as we explore practical advice, inspiring stories, and heartfelt encouragement to help you thrive. Let's grow a sustainable, meaningful life together, both in the home and on the homestead. Happy March, neighbor. Has this year flown by as fast for you as it has for me? I tell you, it is so hard to believe that it is March already. But March also brings something super exciting for us here on the podcast at Simply Living Homestead. We are doing an entire month of gardening content. We're going to start with setting up your garden for the first time. What do you need to consider? We're going to talk about other things that you can consider in a garden, how to make it more sustainable with less burnout and taking care of some problems that may arise. We also have a really cool interview planned this month from Clyde Majerus with Clyde's Garden Planner. I got to interview him at the Homesteader of Iowa's expo in February, and I just had a lovely time getting to meet him and know him a little bit, and I'm sure when that interview drops that you guys will enjoy that as well. At the end of this month, we will be talking about gardening in small spaces, as well as kind of going over what plants to expect at what time of the year. So lots of stuff planned this month. Let's jump right in to starting a garden, the first steps. What do you need to do to start a garden? If you've never done it before, what should you be considering? And if you have done it before, maybe there is something in this episode that you will take and apply to what you're doing in your home right now. So I grew up in the garden, watching my great aunts, my grandma, my mom work the land and put away food for the next year. It was something that I just, from the smallest time that I can remember, that's where we are. And as I became an adult, I have photos of our 4-year-old who was, I think 6 months at the time, sitting out there eating dirt in the garden, in the same garden that I grew up in. I was very blessed to learn these skills firsthand, and I'm excited to get to pass them on to you. When I first came back to the farm, one of the first things I took over was the garden. The family was doing and going through a number of time-consuming things, and it just made sense for me to take that and handle it. Today, some of the things that we are going to be touching on is layout planning, seed planning, and water. Next week, we'll be talking about supports, a little bit of compost and fertilizer protection for your plants, and a greenhouse, as well as other tips for success. So let's get started. When you are starting a brand new garden, the first thing that you need to consider is where are you going to put it? If you are going to do in-ground traditional garden, you need to make sure that it is relatively flat with no places that it can pool. Like water can pool. You don't want spaces that are going to be soggy for long periods of time. You want it to be able to drain away fairly quickly. But you also don't want a really sandy place. Sand, the water will wash right through sand and it'll take the nutrients with it. So you got to find a spot that is a good balance there. The other thing to consider just real quick is sunlight. How is the sunlight hitting where you want to put it. Think about how the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. If you are in the northern hemisphere, the sunlight is not directly above you, as it would be at the equator. It is south of you. So the light is actually shining south to north. So you want to be able to run your rows north and south. That will provide the maximum amount of sunlight to really hit your garden and not block other things in the garden as the sunlight is coming down. The other thing, like trees, bushes, other crops, those can all impact how that sunlight is hitting your crops. Most crops are going to want full sun. There are a few things that you can plant in the shade or in partial shade, but most of them are going to be needing and demanding sunlight. So when you are thinking about where am I going to put this garden, that is the first thing that you need to consider. Walk out in the middle of the day. Better yet, if you can do it in the middle of summer, if you can not break ground this spring and you can stand in the middle of the summer and consider this, that is the best way. But I completely understand if you want to get into this. So, even in the spring, walk out there, middle of the summer, or middle of the daylight, good grief, and look at how the shadows are laying, how everything is hitting the ground, and do some considering there about how the sunlight is going to hit. The next thing to consider is obstacles based on where you put the garden when you want to expand your garden in the future. You could be in a really tight place if you don't consider what is around it. So obstacles are obviously going to contribute to that sunlight problem. But even if you're standing there going well, the sunlight's not going to affect this, it's fine. Look around, are there things that you could potentially be running into that would hinder how big you can expand your garden out to? Because you might be starting kind of small this year, which is great. That helps to avoid overwhelm, but you should really consider what is around you. All right, in-ground benefits. So whether you're going to put in raised beds or in-ground, the first two things are your sunlight, your location, and the obstacles around it. Very important. So let's decide, are you going to break ground or are you going to build a raised bed and bring in soil? In-ground benefits, you don't have to bring in any extra material. And less watering is needed, generally speaking. That does vary based on what your soil conditions are. But you don't have to bring in all that extra material, and for the most part, it will stay a little bit wetter for a little longer. I found, at least for my raised beds, and it absolutely could have to do way more with what is in the beds, but they drain, they dry out a lot faster, so I'm putting more water on my raised beds than I am my in-ground spaces. Other in-ground benefits is, you don't have to, it's low overhead cost, you don't have to pay a whole lot, but the con is that there's some considerable work to get it to the place that you're ready to really truly work it. Getting rid of the sod and everything where you're working it does take time, but it will pay off in the end. Raised beds benefit is you have a greater control of the soil. You can go buy exactly what you want to put in your bed. That's not to say that in ground you can't amend it or make it better. Absolutely you can. But you have a greater control of what you're starting with. What your starting product is on a raised bed, you have a greater control of that. The other thing is it's easier to put in paths so you can walk down it. The reason that I really like our raised beds, and mind you, they are not very raised, they're like 6 inches, is I have like this defined space where things can go. And I can put in paths. And it's been really interesting on the wet years that what has happening is I can walk down and I can pull weeds even though we just had 2 inches of rain. Where previously growing up, like we wouldn't be able to get into the garden for a week because to walk down the paths to like between the rows to get there wouldn't work super great. So some couple of things to consider. There's a lot more that could be said about the pros and cons of in-ground to raised beds. There's a lot of information on the web. You will be able to find something to kind of make that decision, but you do need to make that decision about where you're going to go with it. Okay, so let's break ground. If you're going to build a raised bed, go ahead and build that raised bed. You can put logs clear at the bottom and then fill the rest up with soil and compost. If you're going to break ground and do a traditional in-ground garden, and you've either never made a garden before, or maybe you're in a new location and you've had previously someone else had broke ground. If you have minimal tools, the easiest way to do it is to take a shovel and take that top couple of inches of sod and flip it over. Go down 3-4 inches and simply take it and flip it over. That the grass roots will be exposed and they will get into the sunlight and they will dry up and shrivel up, and underneath that grass is going to break down and it's going to like be that first push of mulch and compost right in that. If it is like traditional grass from like your that would be in like your front lawn. If it is cutting more into native grasses, I've seen those be a little bit more hardy, and it would probably be better to just take that whole top off, give it a good shake, knock out as much of that dirt as you can so you don't have to bring any more in, or you're not lowering the ground level by too much. But you might want to remove some of it if you're dealing with like native grasses as opposed to traditional grasses. But that's really what you're going to do, is you are going to like mark out where you want to go and get in there and rip up and rip out that sod. When the pioneers first came to the Midwest, that's what they were doing, is that they were simply turning it over. Some of them were taking it off and making, sod houses and things. But for the most part, it was just getting ripped and turned over, and it goes back into the soil, provide nutrients. If you or your neighbor or someone around you, a friend, has a tiller, you absolutely can do that. Especially after you've kind of removed that like top layer of grass. Running a tiller through it and kind of loosening up that dirt is good. I've been learning a lot about no-till, and not this spring, but another time we will be talking more about no-till practices. So at this moment, as far as I have to say about that is just you can use the tiller occasionally to break up stuff, but it is good practice to work your soil without fully churning it. But we'll get into that at another episode. All right, so your bed is prepared. Either you have a raised bed and the soil is ready for seed, or you have opened up your new garden and the soil is ready for seed. All right, let's do some seeding. I'm going to throw a quick plug in here for square foot gardening. Square foot gardening is my preferred method that I have picked up in the last couple of years. I find it to be way more like easy to maintain. The premise is that you are packing your garden, like either the same vegetable or companion plants tighter together, and in little 1 square foot boxes. The boxes themselves are oftentimes imaginary, but you're kind of thinking about your garden in 1 square foot sections and working across. I find it to be a more straightforward way of doing it. There is a whole book by the creator of Square Foot Gardening. It is a very easy book to read. I will do a podcast on that as well in the future, but I don't think we will be, we won't have the time to touch on it this spring. So look for that in the future. If you haven't, subscribe. It's coming down the pipeline someday. The alternate to square foot gardening is traditional row planting. I think by traditional, that is at least the Western world's traditional way of doing it. Where you're taking and you're either single planting or double row planting your seed down a long row. And then you have a walking path next to it. And the walking path is usually fairly narrow. Think like 1.5 feet, usually at max. When the plants have grown up, a lot of times that middle path is at least somewhat covered. So that's the traditional way of doing it, and the way that my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, they all ran it that way. And that's what you're going to see when you're driving around and seeing other people's gardens a lot of times. If you have a raised bed, highly encourage you to look up square foot gardening. Especially if you're going to go with a raised bed, look up square foot gardening. I think it's amazing, but like I said, not the episode for it. All right, so let's get into planting. Things that you need to consider is, what do you want to grow? So I would encourage you to think about what you eat from the grocery store or from the farmers markets, what you eat the most, and start with those things. I don't know that there's any one plant that's any easier than another. I honestly can't think of any. I can tell you what I know the most about, but I can't tell you that one plant is any easier than another. So start with what you want to eat. What do you like to eat? Grow those things. Where are you going to get the seed? There are a lot of really good seed companies. You ask anybody around you, ask your neighbors, ask a gardening friend, where do you get your seed? And every person is going to tell you a different place, probably. So go ahead and look it up. Find a seed company that's closest to you if you can. If you can find a seed company that is close to you, their seeds are going to have been grown in a climate that's very similar to you, and so their plants are going to be, the plants that grow from those seeds are going to be much more adapted to your type of weather conditions. So if you are in the South, down in Texas, close to the Gulf or something, it probably wouldn't be wise to buy seeds from Minnesota. It just probably wouldn't be. Likewise, the other way around, because those seeds are not acclimated to your what's going on, the pests that you're dealing with or the weather that you're dealing with. So go local if possible. You should be able to find where your seed company is located on their website. And then you got to decide when you should plant each one. And this is where I am going to plug Clyde's Garden Planner. I love this thing. I walked into the show. He had a booth. He was one of our speakers at the Homesteaders of Iowa Expo in February. And I walked in and took one look at that, and I said, I need to tell my followers about this. I need to tell my listeners about this. We will be talking more about his garden planner here in 2 weeks when we do his episode. And when his episode launches, we will be doing a giveaway for all of the listeners for his gardener planner, so you can get your hands on it. For now, just know that it's a little chart, a little sliding chart that has all of the first plant dates, and you can adjust it to your frost date. So if you're in Ohio, your frost date is going to be different than me here in Iowa. And you can kind of adjust it to what your frost date is going to be, and it'll tell you when you can start putting those seeds in the ground. And I absolutely love it. It also has a backside where it tells you how to do a fall garden. I just love it. I just love it so much. So it will be linked in the show notes, in the description, if you want to check it out now. But in 2 weeks, we will be doing a giveaway for it. So super excited for that. And then the last thing that you get to decide when you are planting is how you lay out each plant. Clyde's Garden Planner actually has a companion plant, like what works really well next to each other. You can find that information as well on like Pinterest. It's pretty easy to find it there. I'm not very good at companion planting yet, something I hope to get better on. But, you do need to think about how tall something is going to grow, and just a little bit of research about what you are planting specifically. A bush bean is going to grow a lot shorter than a pole bean is going to grow. And you don't want to stick a pole bean or corn, for example, to the south of lettuce. Lettuce doesn't need very much sunlight, so I guess that wasn't a very good example. You probably don't want to put corn next to your bush beans, where the bush beans are to the north of the corn, because bush beans do need full sun. And, that's going to shade it out for a large percentage of your day. That's part of the reason for running your rows north and south. But if you do happen to have to run them east and west, you really then need to think about how tall something is going to grow and where you're going to put each one. I recommend taking a piece of paper, kind of drawing out your garden, and just like labeling things as you go on that piece of paper. You can do it online if you're techie. There's a couple of pretty cool programs for seed planting and layout that have just recently popped up. But honestly, pen and paper, especially when you're just starting out, is a really, really solid way to go. Just kind of do a rough sketch of your garden and the number of rows that you're going to have, and then start labeling them. Put a date if you can keep track of it. Maybe it's hung downstairs right by your door where you can see it. Maybe it's in your kitchen or something. If you know what date, or like roughly the week at least, kind of when you planted it, that'll help you know if you walk out there and you're like, man, this should have been growing by now. Why didn't it? You'll kind of have an idea if if it should be germinated or not. All right, lastly, water. How are you going to water the space? Watering can, look a lot of different ways. When you're first starting out, especially, again, if you're in ground, if it's rained that week, you probably don't need to water unless you're running 90-degree weather. And in that case, the ground is going to dry out. For watering in your garden, it's kind of very similar to the premise that people tell you when you have plants in the house, where if you stick your finger down inside and, the top inch or so is dry, it's time for water. So that's kind of a good way of checking it. Our garden, unfortunately, didn't get cared for a few years, and the land just dries out something fierce, and it gets like really hard, and we get like cracks running through the ground. If that happens, you need more water. We really shouldn't have gotten to that place in the first place. Water should have been, put down. You can water with a bucket and a can. You can buy a watering can. You can buy a spray nozzle for your hose and water that way. If you put in a particularly large garden, you can run a sprinkler, run a hose from your house or from a frost-free hydrant on your property, run a hose over, run a sprinkler. If you have a frost-free hydrant, I would recommend you look into drip irrigation. Maybe not your first year, but, if you're finding watering to be something that you often forget or it's hard to maintain, consider drip irrigation. You'll turn it on. You can even set a timer and completely forget about it. I haven't even got that sophisticated. Oftentimes, like where we're at, we don't really have to water until we're getting to the end of June. A lot of times we don't have to water. Sometimes in June we do, but usually it's just July and August and maybe a little September that we're watering. Some weeks we're watering as much as twice a week. I think maybe there's been times where we'll do 3 times a week. So that kind of gives you an idea of how often we're watering, making sure something has water. Obviously, different plants want different water amounts. I can't really speak to that in this guide. Yeah, I mean, that's something where if you want to get that techie, you absolutely can, and that information is available to you. That's a wrap on today's episode about starting your first garden. Whether you're brand new to gardening or looking to refine your approach, I hope these steps help you get started with confidence. From choosing the right location and planning your layout to selecting seeds and figuring out how to water efficiently, there's a lot to think about, but don't let that overwhelm you. Gardening is a journey, and every season is a chance to learn and improve. Next week, we'll be diving deeper into garden success, covering things like plant supports, compost, fertilizers, protection, and even a couple of greenhouse tips. So be sure to tune in for that. If you have any questions or want to share your own garden plans, send me an email at connect@simplylivingHomestead.com. I'd love to hear from you. Well, neighbor, before you head out, I just want to say how much I've loved spending this time with you. If you too enjoyed our time together, don't forget to give us a follow and leave a quick review on your favorite podcast player. It really helps more women like us find their way to a simpler, more joyful life. And hey, if you know someone who'd enjoy this episode, why not share it with them? Let's keep growing this circle of encouragement together. Oh, and don't forget to join my email list. I've got some free printables and weekly tips waiting for you to help you live a purposeful, balanced life, one rooted right in the heart and home. Thanks for being here, friend. You're doing a great job. I can't wait to chat again next week here at the Simply Living Homestead.